The war drum had not yet stopped shaking the ground when Shagrol Fireblood drew her blade on her own kin. "Say it again," she said, low and even, though her knuckles had gone pale around the hilt. "Say it again, Brucknar, and I will carve the words out of your throat myself." Brucknar Ironjaw did not flinch. He was built like a felled oak, shoulders wide enough to block torchlight, and he wore his victories the way other orcs wore scars, proudly, openly, as though the world owed him admiration for them. He had fought 7 suitors for her hand in the combat trials and broken every one of their arms or jaws to prove it. He had expected gratitude. He had gotten a blade at his throat instead. "You dishonor your father in front of the whole camp," he said, spreading his hands as if to show the assembled clan how reasonable he was being, how patient. "I won the trial fair. The old ways say you are mine. The old ways say I have the right of refusal if I hold a warrior's rank," Shagrol snapped. "And I have held mine since before you could lift a shield above your own head. I refuse you, Brucknar. I refused you at the fire circle, and I refuse you now, in front of every soul who will remember it." Around them, the war camp had gone still. Hide tents stretched in rows down the slope, their smoke holes leaking thin gray threads into the dusk, and every orc within earshot had turned to watch, weapons half raised, breath held. Firelight caught on Shagrol's leathers, dark and fitted close to a body honed by a decade of border skirmishes. A bodice of hardened hide laced tight across her ribs, vambraces scarred from old blades, a long knife strapped to her thigh beside the curved sword she now held level and steady. Her tusks were small for an orc, elegant rather than brutish, and her eyes, a deep amber gold, burned with a fury that made even seasoned warriors step back. Chief Shagrol Fireblood, her own father, stood on the raised earth before the central fire with his arms crossed and his face a mask of old grief. He had buried 2 sons in the wars against the human kingdoms. He had no wish to bury a daughter to pride, but peace with Ironjaw's faction hung on this match, and he had promised it before the whole council. "Shagrol," his voice cracked like a whip across the clearing, "you will not humiliate this clan before the eyes of the Ironjaw line. Sheath your blade." "I will not marry a man who thinks a broken arm is the same as a corded heart," she said, and something in her voice trembled just once before the steel returned. "I would rather freeze on a bare hillside than warm his bed, father. Choose your peace elsewhere." The silence that followed was worse than any shout. Brucknar's jaw tightened, his hand drifting toward the axe at his belt, and for a heartbeat the whole camp seemed to lean forward, waiting for blood. "Enough!" Shagrol's word fell like a stone into still water. "The law is the law, and pride has cost this clan enough sons already. Shagrol Fireblood, you have refused a rightful claim before the fire circle, and in doing so you have broken the peace I swore to keep. I will not have you slain for it, nor will I force you to a bed you despise. But you cannot stay among us and wear this shame like a badge. You will take what you can carry and you will vanish into the hills. Let the wind and the wolves judge whether your pride was worth the cost." The words landed harder than any blow. Exile. Not death, which would have been almost kinder in its simplicity, but a slow unmaking, a name struck from the roll of the clan, a fire that would burn nowhere near the others ever again. Brucknar's mouth curled, satisfaction flickering through the anger. "The hills will humble her faster than my hands ever could," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Shagrol did not look at him again. She sheathed her sword with a motion so controlled it looked almost gentle, though her chest heaved with the effort of holding herself together in front of every warrior who had once called her sister-in-arms. She looked instead at her father, and for one unguarded instant the fury dropped away and there was only a daughter, staring at the man who had just cast her out to save a peace she did not believe in. "You could have chosen me," she said quietly. "I chose the clan," Shagrol answered, and the words cost him visibly. "As I always have. Go before I lose the courage to let you." She turned on her heel, shoulders straight, chin high, and walked out through the ring of firelight and staring faces without once breaking stride, though every eye in the war camp followed her, and more than a few watched with something close to pity quickly hidden, because pity was its own kind of dishonor in a camp like this. By the time she crested the first ridge above the tents, the drums had started again behind her, low and steady, already forgetting. The hills rose dark and cold ahead, a tangle of scrub pine and broken granite that separated the war camp from the human lands beyond, lands held by a treaty older than she was and thinner than the paper it had been written on. She had nothing but the weapons on her hips, a bedroll and a fury that had nowhere left to burn. She walked until the camp's firelight was a memory, and then she kept walking, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant grief, and grief was a luxury an exile could not afford. 2 ridges over, in a hollow where a spring fed down into a narrow stream, Wesley Graves was banking his own small fire for the night, and trying not to think about how little flour was left in his mill's storeroom. He was not a large man, not by the standards of the frontier towns that dotted the border, and certainly not by the standards of the Orc clans, whose war camps his village had learned, over one uneasy generation, to live beside rather than against. He was broad enough through the shoulders from years of hauling grain sacks and turning millstones, with hands calloused and scarred from 100 small accidents, and a quiet, watchful face that had earned him the reputation in Millhaven of a man who listened more than he spoke. His hair was the brown of turned earth, his eyes a steady gray, and he wore a plain wool coat over a linen shirt, the collar open against the evening warmth, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had come up into the hills, as he did every few weeks, to check the spring that fed the leat running down to his mill wheel, because the drought that had cracked half the fields in the valley below had begun eating even at that stubborn little stream. And if it failed, the wheel would stop. And if the wheel stopped, Millhaven would starve slower than it would have otherwise, but starve all the same. He had built his fire small and low, more habit than necessity, and was chewing on a strip of dried venison and worrying over sums that did not add up, when he heard the crack of a branch that was too deliberate to be an animal. He was on his feet with his hunting knife out before he had fully decided to move, which was, he would later admit, the only reason he was not already dead, because the figure that stepped into the low orange light of his fire could have ended him with one hand. She was tall, taller than him by half a head, and built with a strength that even the fitted leathers could not disguise, curves and muscle both, a bodice of dark hide laced snug across a narrow waist, vambraces buckled at her forearms, her sword still on her hip though her hand was not on it. Green skin caught the firelight in shades of moss and shadow. Her dark hair was bound back in a thick braid that fell past her shoulder, and her eyes, when they found his, were a deep gold that seemed to weigh him entirely in one long look and find him, to his considerable surprise, not worth killing. "Put the knife down, little Miller," she said, and her voice was rough and low and carried an accent that turned every word into something almost musical. "If I meant to gut you, I would have done it before you heard me." "How do you know I am a miller?" he managed, because it was easier than asking any of the more urgent questions crowding behind his teeth. "You smell of flour and stone dust." A corner of her mouth curved, not quite a smile. "And your hands are wrong for a soldier, too careful." He did not lower the knife, not entirely, but he did not raise it either. "You are from the war camp." "I was." Something flickered behind her eyes, gone before he could name it. "I am nothing tonight." "An exile, if the word means anything to you. Cast out to vanish into these hills and die quietly where no one has to watch." The bitterness in her voice was so raw that he found himself, against every instinct that 6 years of border stories should have hammered into him, lowering the knife the rest of the way. "That is a hard sentence," he said. "It is meant to be." She studied him a moment longer, head tilted, and then, without asking, without so much as a "by your leave," she crossed the clearing, gathered a handful of dry branches from the edge of the tree line, and began building a second fire, close enough to his that the 2 ranges of light overlapped, close enough that he could feel the heat of her presence like a wall at his back. "I did not invite you to share my fire," Wesley said, more startled than offended. You did not chase me off either. She crouched, feeding kindling into the new flame with quick, sure motions, the muscles of her forearms shifting under green skin, and glanced up at him through the smoke. I have spent 3 nights alone on this hillside, Miller, listening to wolves and my own thoughts, and I find I like neither. You have a fire and you do not seem inclined to put a knife in me. That is more hospitality than I expected from your kind. My kind, he echoed. Humans. She said it without heat, simply a fact laid on the ground between them. Who burned 3 of our camps in my grandfather's time and call it a border war. Who look at a green face and see a monster before they see a person. I do not know your grandfather, Wesley said carefully, sitting back down slowly, knife loose in his hand though he no longer felt the need for it, and I have never burned anything but my own bread. I am no soldier. I turn a mill wheel and try to keep my village fed, and lately I am not doing a very good job of even that. Something in his tone, tired and plain and utterly without pretense, seemed to catch her off guard. She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time, not as a threat to be measured or a fool to be dismissed, but as a man. What is your name, Miller? Wesley Graves. Shagrol. She said it like a challenge, like she expected him to stumble over it, and when he did not, when he simply nodded and repeated it back correctly, something in her shoulders eased by a fraction. Shagrol Fireblood. Fireblood, he said. That is a fine name to lose. I did not lose it, she said sharply. It was taken. There is a difference. Then, quieter, almost to herself, though I suppose out here it means as little as any other word. They sat in silence for a while, the 2 fires throwing their light together into one wide circle on the dark grass, and Wesley found himself doing something he had not done in longer than he cared to admit, which was simply watching another living creature exist near him without wanting anything from him in return. It was, he realized with some surprise, one of the more peaceful moments he had known in a year. You are not afraid of me, Shagrol said eventually, and it was not quite a question. I am a little afraid of you, Wesley admitted. You could probably break me in half without much effort. But you have not, and you built your fire next to mine instead of taking my supplies and leaving me for dead, which is more than most men would do for a stranger of any size. So I find the fear is losing the argument. That earned him a real laugh, short and surprised out of her, a sound like gravel and warmth both. You are either very brave or very stupid, Wesley Graves. My neighbors would say the second, he said, and found to his own astonishment that he wanted to hear that laugh again. They struck their bargain before the fire burned low. She would not go near the village, not yet. Not until he understood what kind of welcome an orc exile might expect there, which they both suspected, without saying so aloud, would be no welcome at all. In exchange for his silence about her presence in the hills, she would help him find the source of the spring's trouble, because she had spent years learning the shapes of hill country and knew things about water and stone that no miller ever had cause to learn. It was a fair trade, practical, bloodless, the kind of arrangement 2 wary strangers make when neither wants to admit how badly they want an excuse to see the other again. Neither of them said that last part aloud. But when Wesley finally lay down to sleep with his back to his own fire, he found himself listening to the quiet crackle of hers only a few feet away, and he slept better than he had in months. The days that followed took on a shape neither of them had planned for. Wesley came up into the hills more often than the spring truly required, and told himself each time that it was only prudent to check the water levels given the drought, and Shagrol was always there, at her own fire a little closer to his than the night before, until by the end of the 2nd week there was really only one fire between them, built jointly, tended jointly, a small ring of stones that had somehow become theirs. She taught him to read the land the way she had been taught, how a certain lean in the grass meant water beneath it, how the color of moss on granite told you which way the wind mostly blew, and he taught her, in turn, the patient mechanics of his mill, sketching the wheel and the gears in the dirt with a stick while she watched with the same fierce concentration she must have once given to a battle plan. "You care for that wheel the way some men care for a horse," she observed one evening, watching him work a knot out of rope he had carried up from the mill. "It is the whole village's bread," Wesley said. "Every family in Millhaven eats because that wheel turns. If it stops, we do not just go hungry, we go under. I have watched 3 farms fail this year already because the harvest was thin and there was nothing to fall back on. That wheel is the only thing standing between us and worse than that." "And who stands between you and worse than that?" she asked, and there was something serious under the teasing in her voice. He glanced up, caught by the directness of it, the way she never seemed to ask a question she did not actually want answered. "No one, I suppose. I manage." "You should not have to manage alone," Shagrol said, and reached across the fire to take the rope from his hands, her fingers brushing his green skin against sun-browned, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as either might once have expected. It was a small touch, nothing more, but it lit something in him he had thought long banked to ash, and when she looked up and caught the color rising in his face, she did not look away either. She smiled, slow and deliberate, a warrior's confidence dressed in something softer. "You blush like a boy, Miller." "You are the first person to make me blush in a long while," he said honestly, because lying seemed pointless with those gold eyes fixed so plainly on him. "Good," Shagrol said. "I intend to keep doing it." He laughed, startled and delighted despite himself, and the fire between them burned a little brighter for it. It could not last in secret forever, of course. Millhaven was a small place, huddled at the base of the hills along the sluggish river that fed the mill pond, a scatter of stone cottages and timber barns, a general store, a chapel with a crooked steeple, and a tavern that doubled as the only gathering hall the village could afford. Word traveled fast in a place that small, and eyes were sharper than any of them had accounted for. It was a boy, one of the Holly's children out setting snares along the tree line, who first saw the second fire glowing on the hillside where no fire should be, and ran back to the village breathless with the news that there was an orc camped above the mill. By the time Wesley came down the next morning with a sack of hill herbs Shagrol had shown him how to gather, half the village was already assembled at the edge of the mill pond, with torches unlit but ready, pitchforks, a few old crossbows, and Elder Corwin Hale standing at the front of them with his arms crossed and his face set like stone. "Graves," Corwin's voice carried across the water. "The boy says there is a monster camped in your hills. Tell me he is wrong." Wesley's stomach dropped straight through the ground. He set the sack down slowly, buying himself half a breath to think, and found none of the thoughts particularly useful. "There is an orc in the hills," he said carefully. "She is exiled from her own clan. She has done nothing to threaten this village." The murmur that ran through the crowd was ugly, thick with old fear dressed up as certainty. "She," someone repeated, as if the word itself were an accusation. "You have been keeping company with it," Corwin said, and the disgust in his voice was plain. "Have you lost your senses, man? Have you forgotten what their kind did to this valley 30 years back? My own father lost an arm to an orc raid before you were born." "That was war," Wesley said, louder now, planting his feet. "This is one woman alone, cast out by her own people, trying to survive. She has not so much as looked at Millhaven with anything but caution. And you would know," someone shouted from the back of the crowd, "seeing as you have apparently been up there sharing her fire." Laughter, cruel and nervous, rippled through the gathering, and Wesley felt his ears burn, but he held his ground. It was at that moment, with the worst possible timing and the best possible courage, that Shagrol came down the hill path behind him, drawn by the noise, her sword sheathed but her stride unmistakably that of a warrior expecting trouble and unwilling to run from it. The crowd's murmur died into a hard silence. Crossbows came up. Pitchfork tines caught the morning light. "Do not," Wesley said, stepping backward so that he stood between the villagers and Shagrol without quite deciding to do it, his heart hammering hard enough that he was sure they could all hear it. "Do not, any of you. She has not raised a hand against a soul in this valley. Step aside, Miller, Corwin barked, before you get hurt defending a beast that will turn on you the moment it suits her. I will not step aside. His voice cracked slightly on the words, but he did not move, and behind him he felt Shagrol come to a halt as well, close enough that he could feel the tension coiled in her, ready to fight if it came to that, but holding, waiting, because she had seen the shape of what he was doing and some instinct told her to let him try it his way first. You would put your own life between hers and your neighbor's. Corwin's voice had gone quieter, more disbelieving than angry now. I would put my life between any innocent person and a mob, Wesley said. That is what this is, Corwin. Look at yourselves. A crowd of frightened people ready to kill a woman who has done nothing but exist too close to your fear. For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Then old Mabel Croft, who kept the village's only working loom and had buried 2 sons of her own in the border wars, lowered her pitchfork an inch, and said, in a voice gone thin with something that was not quite forgiveness but was not quite hatred either, "Let the boy speak his piece, Corwin. We are not murderers here, not yet." It broke the spell just enough. Weapons lowered, not all the way, not with any real warmth, but enough that the immediate danger of the moment passed. And Corwin, after a long measuring look at Wesley and an even longer one at Shagrol standing tall and silent behind him, finally said, "She does not come into this village. She does not touch our herds or our stores. And you, Wesley Graves, had best pray she is as harmless as you claim, because if she is not, the blame falls on you as much as her." "I accept that," Wesley said, and meant it entirely. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering, casting glances back over their shoulders, and when the last of them had gone, Wesley turned to find Shagrol watching him with an expression he had not seen on her before, something unguarded and searching, as though she were trying to reconcile the plain, quiet Miller she had shared a fire with against the man who had just stood unarmed between her and a dozen leveled weapons. "You are a fool," she said softly. "So I have been told. You could have died just now for a woman you have known 2 weeks. I could have," Wesley agreed. "I did not much like the alternative." She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and before he could brace for it or even fully understand what was happening, she caught his face in both hands, hands that could have crushed stone, and held him with a gentleness that undid him far more thoroughly than any strength could have, and kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. It was hungry and certain, the kiss of a woman who had decided something and did not intend to be argued out of it. And Wesley, after one startled heartbeat, kissed her back with everything the last lonely years had left banked up inside him. When she finally drew back, both of them breathing hard, she pressed her forehead to his and said, low and rough, "No one has ever stood between me and danger before, Miller. My whole life I have been the one doing the standing. I did not know what it would feel like to have someone do it for me." "I would do it again," Wesley said. "Gladly." "I know," she said, and there was wonder in it and something that sounded almost like fear. "That is what frightens me." Over the following weeks, whatever had cracked open between them widened into something neither of them could have called simple friendship any longer, no matter how carefully they might have tried to name it that way in front of others. Shagrol still would not come into the village proper, not with Corwin's warning hanging over her, but she took to meeting Wesley at the edge of the tree line most evenings, and more than once she walked the mile down to the mill pond in the deep dark after the village had gone to sleep, simply to sit with him on the sluice gate and watch the water turn silver under the moon. She helped him, in her own fierce practical way, more than she had ever promised to. She found where a fallen tree had begun choking the spring feeding his leet, and together they cleared it with axes and rope, and no small amount of arguing over the best method, arguing that always ended in laughter, and often in her hauling the heaviest end of the log herself despite his protests, simply because she could, and it pleased her to prove it. She discovered, one gray drizzling afternoon, that Wesley had been quietly giving away flour to the poorest families in Millhaven even as his own stores ran thin, and said nothing about it at the time, But that night she brought him a brace of hill hares she had snared, dropped them at his feet with a flourish, and said only, "Eat." A man cannot feed a village on nothing. He had not asked how she had known he needed it. He had simply understood, more clearly than he had understood almost anything in his life, that he had found someone who watched him closely enough to notice what he did not say. The nights grew cooler as the season turned, and the two fires that had once burned a careful distance apart had become, in practice, one shared hearth, their bedrolls laid close enough that neither had to reach far to find the other's hand in the dark. It was on one such night, with the first hard frost silvering the grass and the war camp's drums silent and distant across the ridges, that Shagrol told him what she had been carrying since the night of her exile. "There is a custom among my people," she said, staring into the fire rather than at him, which told him more than her tone did that this mattered a great deal. "When a warrior chooses a mate, truly chooses, not through trial or arrangement but through the heart's own reckoning, she marks him. A bite here." She touched the curve of his shoulder where it met his neck and her fingers lingered. "It scars. It does not fade. Any orc who sees it knows what it means. It is a claim, Wesley. A binding no clan law can undo, not even exile, not even death." "And you want to give me that mark," Wesley said, his voice not quite steady. "I have wanted to since the day I stood between torches and pitchforks and watched a man with no sword put his body between me and a mob for no reason but that he thought it was right." She looked at him then, gold eyes bright in the firelight, fierce and unguarded both. "I do not offer this lightly, Miller. If I mark you, you are mine in every way my people understand the word, and I am yours the same, whether either of our peoples ever approve of it or not." Wesley reached up and covered her hand with his own where it still rested against his shoulder. "I have spent most of my life feeling like a man nobody particularly needed," he said quietly. "You have made me feel wanted in a way I did not know I was hungry for until you did it. If this mark means I get to keep that feeling, keep you, then I want it more than I have ever wanted anything." "It will hurt," she warned him. "I do not care." She studied him a long moment, searching, perhaps, for any flicker of doubt, and finding none, she finally nodded, slow and solemn, before something warmer broke through the solemnity, a smile that was almost shy on a face built for battle. What followed was tender in a way that surprised them both. Her strength gentled to something careful and reverent, his hesitance melting under the certainty of her hands, the fire burning low and gold beside them, while the cold autumn night held its breath around their small, warm circle of grass and stone. When at last she bent her head to his shoulder and marked him, the pain of it was sharp and brief, and utterly eclipsed by the way she gathered him against her afterward, murmuring words in the old tongue of her people that he did not understand but felt entirely, her arms strong and certain around him, as though she meant to hold the whole world back from him if it ever tried to take him away. Afterward, lying tangled together beneath a shared blanket with the mark on his shoulder still tender beneath her palm, Wesley laughed softly into her hair. "What?" she asked. "I came up into these hills to check on a spring," he said. "I did not expect to find the rest of my life." "Neither did I," Shagrol admitted, "and I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong. They should have known better than to think the world would let them keep that peace for long. It was Brucknar Ironjaw who found them 3 weeks later, and it was worse, far worse, than either of them could have imagined." He had not accepted Shagrol's exile quietly. Pride like his did not simply fade because a chief had spoken. It curdled and it hunted. He had spent weeks scouting the border hills with 2 of his kinsmen, telling himself and anyone who asked that he meant only to be certain the exile had not died and brought further shame on the clan by her carcass being found by human hunters. But the truth, which he did not examine too closely even in his own mind, was that he could not bear the thought of her refusing him and simply surviving anyway, free and unbowed. Somewhere he could not reach her. He found the trampled grass first, the shared fire ring, the 2 bedrolls that had become one. And then, On a bright autumn morning, when the Millhaven Harvest Fair had drawn most of the village down to the green by the chapel, and Wesley had come, cautiously, at Shagrol's insistence, to trade a sack of milled flour for a length of good rope, Brucknar came striding out of the tree line at the edge of the fairground with his 2 kinsmen at his back, and the whole village froze at the sight of 3 armed orcs walking openly into their gathering. "Where is she?" Brucknar demanded, and his voice carried across the green like a thunderclap, silencing the fiddler mid-tune. "Fireblood, I know she has been seen near this place. Bring her out, or I will burn every stone of it looking." Panic rippled through the fair, villagers grabbing children, reaching for whatever tools lay nearest, and it was only Wesley stepping forward, flour sack still in his arms, that kept the moment from tipping straight into slaughter. "There is no need for burning anything," he said, keeping his voice as level as he could manage with his heart trying to climb out through his throat. "If you are looking for Shagrol Fireblood, I can take you to her without a single person here getting hurt." Brucknar's gaze swung to him, and something ugly and delighted crossed his face, as though he had just found a piece he had not known he was missing. "You," he said, "the little human she has been hiding with." "I wondered." "She is not hiding," Wesley said. "She is surviving, as you ordered her to." "I ordered no such thing," Brucknar snarled, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, and before Wesley could brace himself, a huge fist closed in the front of his shirt and hauled him half off his feet, the fabric tearing at the collar as Brucknar shook him like a dog might shake a rat. "Her father ordered the exile. I only meant to see it enforced properly, not turned into a den for her to rut with some human worm who cannot even hold a sword." It was in that violent, careless motion, the shirt tearing wide at the collar, that the mark on Wesley's shoulder came into full view, dark and unmistakable beneath the autumn sunlight, in front of the entire gathered village of Millhaven and the 2 orc kinsmen standing at Brucknar's back. The silence that fell was absolute. Brucknar's grip went slack with shock before fury reclaimed him entirely, his face twisting into something almost unrecognizable. "She marked him," he said, and the words came out strangled, disbelieving. "She marked a human." Behind him, one of his kinsmen made a low sound of pure scandal, and among the villagers, Elder Corwin Hale had gone pale as chalk, staring at the dark bite scar on Wesley's shoulder as though it were a brand of witchcraft. "He bewitched her," Corwin said, loud enough to carry. "Some human man does not simply win an orc warrior's mark. There is sorcery in this." "There is no sorcery," came a voice from the edge of the green, and every head turned as Shagrol Fireblood strode out of the tree line where she had been watching, unwilling in the end, to let Wesley walk into that fair alone, whatever bargain of caution they had struck. She had come armed, and she came now at a pace that made it plain she intended to be heard before anyone raised a weapon. "There is a woman who chose, that is all. I marked him because I love him, and no clan law nor human superstition changes what is already done." "You dishonor yourself," Brucknar spat, releasing Wesley so abruptly he stumbled, "and you dishonor the Fireblood name further than Exile ever could. A human. You would give yourself to a human before you would give yourself to me." "I would give myself to 100 humans before I gave myself to you," Shagrol said, and her voice did not waver, though Wesley, straightening and moving instinctively to stand beside her rather than behind, could see the tension coiling through every line of her body. "Because at least among them, I have found one man with more honor in his little finger than you carry in your whole broken pride." Brucknar's hand went to the axe at his belt, and the crowd surged backward with a collective gasp, and for one suspended, terrible moment, Wesley thought he was about to watch the woman he loved fight for both their lives in front of an audience that would not lift a hand to help her. "Challenge then," Brucknar snarled. "Trial combat as is our right under clan law. If I defeat you, the mark is void, the human dies for his theft, and you come back to camp bound as my prize whether your father likes it or not. If you refuse, I will simply kill him where he stands and take you regardless." "I do not refuse," Shagrol said, without a flicker of hesitation, drawing her sword in one clean motion. But not here, not among people who have no stake in this. We settle it on the ridge where our own kind can bear witness, and you will hold to the outcome as clan law demands, win or lose. Brucknar's grin was all teeth. Gladly. I have wanted this fight since the fire circle. Shagrol. Wesley caught her arm before she could turn away, his voice low and urgent, meant only for her. You do not have to do this alone. I have to do this, she said, gentler now, her free hand coming up to cup his jaw, thumb brushing the corner of his mouth in a touch that felt like a promise despite everything roaring around them. But I am not alone, Wesley Graves. I have never once since the night I built my fire next to yours been alone. That is why I will win. Trust me. He wanted desperately to argue, to insist on standing beside her on that ridge with whatever poor skill he had. But the look in her eyes told him plainly that this was hers to finish, that the years of training and pride and pain that had led her to this moment demanded she meet it on her own terms, and that his place, for now, was to trust the strength she had shown him 100 times already. Then I will be there, he said instead. Watching. Whatever you need after, I will be there. That, she said, kissing him once, hard and brief, in front of the entire stunned village and the 2 gawking orc kinsmen, is all I have ever needed. The ridge Brucknar named for the trial combat was a bald shoulder of granite above the tree line, chosen, Wesley suspected, because it offered no cover and no mercy, a place where pride alone would decide the outcome. Word of the challenge had traveled faster than seemed possible, and by the time the sun stood high the next day, a ragged crowd had gathered on both sides of the ridge, orc warriors from the war camp on one slope, having heard the news through channels Wesley did not fully understand, and a cautious knot of Millhaven villagers on the other, drawn by fear and morbid curiosity both, Corwin Hale and Mabel Croft among them, along with a dozen others who had decided, apparently, that watching a duel from a safe distance was preferable to staying home wondering about its outcome. Chief Shagrol Fireblood himself stood among his people, his face carved from old granite, watching his exiled daughter walk out onto the bald rock with her sword bare and her chin high, and if there was anguish behind his stillness, he did not let it show. Brucknar came from the other side, stripped to the waist despite the cold, showing off scars that told their own story of past victories, and he looked, Wesley thought with his stomach twisting, entirely too confident. Last chance to yield, Brucknar called across the granite. Come back to the clan, take your place beside me, and this ends without blood. It ends with blood either way, Shagrol answered, rolling her shoulders loose, settling into a stance Wesley recognized now from watching her train at their shared fire, weight low, blade angled, patient. Only the question of whose remains open. They came together fast, faster than Wesley had braced for, steel ringing off steel in a rhythm that seemed to shake the whole ridge, and he understood within the first exchange of blows that this was nothing like the clumsy scuffles he had seen break out at the tavern back home. This was 2 lifetimes of training crashing against each other, Brucknar's brute strength driving forward in heavy, hammering strikes meant to break a guard through sheer weight, Shagrol answering with speed and precision, giving ground only to find better footing, never once retreating in a straight line, always circling, always making him chase an angle he could not quite close. The crowd on both slopes had gone utterly silent, the only sound the clash of blades and the ragged breathing of 2 warriors testing each other's limits. Wesley stood at the front of the human side with his hands clenched into fists, every muscle in his body wound tight with the useless, desperate wish that he could do something, anything, to help her, and hating, in that moment, every year he had spent behind a millstone instead of a sword, even as some steadier part of him understood that this was not a fight strength alone could win, that Shagrol needed room to fight her own battle in her own way, and that his presence on the edge of that ridge, steady and unwavering, was itself a kind of help, the only kind he had to give. Brucknar landed a blow at last that drove Shagrol back a full 3 steps, her boots skidding on loose gravel, and a hoarse cheer went up from a few of his kinsmen, before dying quickly under the chief's stony glare. Blood welled along her forearm where his axe had scraped past her guard, and Wesley's heart lurched violently. But she did not fall, did not so much as flinch beyond the necessary correction of her stance, and when Bruckner pressed his advantage, overcommitting to what he clearly believed would be a finishing strike, she was already moving. She dropped low, let his axe pass a hand's width above her head, and drove upward with the flat pommel of her sword into the underside of his jaw with enough force to snap his head back, following it immediately with a sweeping kick that took his legs out from beneath him. He hit the granite hard enough that the sound of it echoed off the far slope, and before he could recover, her blade was at his throat, close enough to draw a thin line of blood without breaking skin further, and the ridge held its breath entirely. "Yield," Shagrol said, chest heaving, blood dripping steadily from the shallow cut on her arm, "and I will let you keep the throat you have used so freely to spit poison about a man worth 10 of you." For a long moment Bruckner's eyes burned with the particular hatred of a man who has never once lost and cannot process the shape of it now that it has happened. Then slowly the fight drained out of him, replaced by something smaller and uglier, resignation dressed as contempt. "I yield," he ground out. "The claim is void. She is no prize of mine, nor bound to any clan law I can invoke." Shagrol did not lower her sword immediately, holding him a moment longer, letting the words settle fully into the watching crowd on both slopes, before she straightened and stepped back, sheathing her blade with the same controlled economy she always showed after violence. Chief Kagran descended the slope himself then, moving through his own warriors, and for a moment Wesley feared some further complication, some new demand of clan law that would tear the fragile victory apart. But the old chief stopped before his daughter, looked at the blood on her arm, the fierce and unbroken set of her shoulders, and something in his stony face finally cracked open into naked grief and pride both at once. "You fought for a life outside the clan," Kagran said, low enough that only those nearest could hear, "and you won it clean by our own law in front of witnesses who cannot dispute it." "I cannot undo the exile without breaking my word before the whole camp, Shagrol, but I will say this in front of every soul on this ridge. No warrior here has ever fought with more honor than you showed today, and whatever life you build beyond our fires, you carry the Fireblood name with you still, whether the law allows you to wear it openly or not." It was not forgiveness, not fully, not the restoration she might once have wanted, but it was something, an old man's version of an apology wrapped inside the only language of honor he had left to offer, and Shagrol, throat working, simply nodded once, sharp and final, before turning away from the war camp's side of the ridge and walking, without hesitation, down toward the small knot of villagers on the human slope, down toward Wesley, who met her halfway and caught her against his chest hard enough that she made a small startled sound before her arms came around him just as fiercely. "You are hurt," he murmured into her hair, feeling the tremor finally working its way through her now that the fight was over and adrenaline had nowhere left to hide. "It is nothing," she said, though she let him examine the cut on her arm anyway, let him press his own torn shirt sleeve against it as a rough bandage, and did not object when Mabel Croft, of all people, pushed forward from the crowd with a jar of stinging salve and a length of clean linen, muttering something about not letting a wound fester regardless of whose blood it was. Elder Corwin Hale watched the exchange from a distance, his expression unreadable, and it was he who finally broke the strange, suspended quiet that had settled over the ridge. "She fought for her life and for his," Corwin said, to no one in particular, though loud enough for the village to hear. "And she did not so much as glance at harming a one of us in all this, when she had ample cause and ample strength to do it. I have spent 30 years believing every green skin was my father's enemy reborn. I am not certain I have earned the right to keep believing that today." It was not an apology either, not quite, but it was a door left open where before there had only been a wall, and Wesley, holding Shagrol against him on that windswept ridge with the war camp's warriors filing away behind them and his own village watching with expressions caught somewhere between wariness and something almost like respect, found that an open door was more than enough to build on. The walk back down from the ridge took the better part of the afternoon, and by the time they reached the mill pond the light had turned long and golden, the water burning amber where it slid over the sluice gate, and Millhaven's harvest fair, abandoned in the chaos of the morning, had never quite resumed, though a few brave souls had relit the cook fires on the green, as though the ordinary rhythm of the village might steady everyone's nerves faster than talking about what had just happened. Shagrol sat on the low stone wall beside the mill pond while Wesley finished binding her arm properly, his hands careful and unhurried, and when he was done she caught his wrist and pulled him down to sit beside her, resting her head against his shoulder, right over the mark that had caused so much trouble, as though daring the world to object again. "Your elder Hale looked at me today like I might not be the devil his stories promised," she said quietly. "You are not," Wesley said. "You are the best thing that has happened to this village since the wheel was built, whether they know it yet or not. I nearly got you killed. You got me claimed," he corrected gently. "Brucknar did the killing part all on his own, or tried to, and you stopped him. There is a difference, and I intend to remember which one it was for the rest of my life." She laughed, tired and real, and turned her face up to his, and he kissed her there in the fading gold light with the whole village close enough to see and neither of them caring in the slightest, because whatever fear had once stood between them and this moment had been fought and bled, and settled on a bare granite ridge that morning, and there was nothing left now but the simple, astonishing fact of two people who had chosen each other and meant to keep choosing. The weeks that followed were not without their friction, because prejudice, Wesley had learned, did not vanish in a single afternoon no matter how dramatic the proof offered against it. There were villagers who still crossed the green rather than pass too close to Shagrol, who still muttered when her name came up at the tavern, who eyed the mark on Wesley's shoulder, visible now that word of it had spread whether he covered it or not, with a wariness that would take longer than a season to fully soften. But there were others, more each week, who found reasons to speak to her directly, to ask, awkwardly at first and then with genuine curiosity, about hill country and hunting and the strange, wide world beyond the border they had spent their whole lives fearing rather than understanding. Mabel Croft, in particular, took a fierce and unlikely liking to her, dragging Shagrol into the weaving shed one afternoon to show off a loom pattern, and emerging an hour later declaring to anyone who would listen that the orc woman had a steadier hand with a shuttle than half the girls in the village. High praise indeed from a woman who did not give it lightly. Hob the blacksmith, gruff and slow to trust, came around more gradually, but came around all the same, the day Shagrol hauled a cartwheel out of a mud-choked ditch that had defeated 3 men and a mule, setting it upright with a grunt of effort and no small satisfaction at the stunned silence that followed. Even Elder Corwin, stiff and proud as he was, found his way eventually to a kind of grudging peace, sealed not by any grand gesture but by a quiet afternoon when Shagrol, without fanfare, helped drag a fallen beam off his youngest grandson's leg after a barn roof gave way in a windstorm, carrying the boy herself down to the healer's cottage, while Corwin ran alongside white-faced and silent, and never again, after that day, spoke of her as anything but by her name. The mill wheel, meanwhile, turned steadier than it had in a year, the spring cleared and running true, the harvest, thin as it was, milled and stored against the coming winter with an efficiency the village had not managed in longer than anyone cared to admit. And if some of that efficiency came from an orc woman who had appointed herself, without asking permission from anyone, guardian of both the mill and its miller, Millhaven found, gradually, that it did not much mind the arrangement. Winter came hard that year, snow piling thick against the hills, and it was in the deep quiet of that first true snowfall, with the mill pond frozen at its edges and smoke rising straight and pale from every chimney in the village, that Wesley finally asked the question that had been sitting, warm and patient, in his chest since the night on the ridge. "Stay," he said simply, standing in the doorway of the small stone cottage attached to the mill, watching her brush snow from her shoulders where she had come down from checking the hillside traps. She still insisted on setting despite the village's growing willingness to trade for meat outright. "Not just tonight, not just for the winter. Stay here with me properly, in whatever way your customs or mine would call proper. I do not have much to offer beyond a mill and a stubborn heart, but both are yours if you will have them." Shagrol set down the brace of hairs she carried, snow still melting in her dark braid, and crossed the small room to him with the same deliberate certainty she had carried into every important moment between them since the first night she built her fire next to his. "I built my fire beside yours because something in me knew, before the rest of me caught up, that I had found the place I wanted to stand," she said, taking his hands in both of hers, calloused and strong and warm despite the cold clinging to her leathers. "I have stood in war camps and battle lines and watched clans rise and fall over pride that meant less than nothing in the end. I have never once in all that time wanted to stay anywhere the way I want to stay here, with you, Wesley Graves. So yes, I will stay, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there is nowhere else I would rather be." They were married in the end, not by any grand ceremony that either side's traditions would fully have recognized, but by a small, fierce, joyful gathering on the green come the first thaw of spring, Millhaven's own priest speaking words meant for human hands joined together. And afterward, at Shagrol's quiet insistence, a second smaller rite performed at dusk by the mill pond, just the two of them, where she pressed her palm flat over the old mark on his shoulder and spoke words in the orc tongue that needed no translation for him to understand their weight. A promise layered over a promise, given and received twice so that neither of their worlds could claim it had been left out. A season later, with the mill wheel turning steady under a soft summer rain and the first good harvest in 3 years ripening gold in the fields below the hills, Wesley Graves stood in the doorway of the cottage he had once lived in alone and watched his wife, home from mending a fence line at the edge of their small holding, striding up the path with her sleeves rolled and mud on her boots, and a smile breaking across her face the moment she caught sight of him, the same fierce, unguarded smile that had first undone him beside a shared fire on a cold hillside a year before. "You are staring, Miller," Shagrol called, still 20 paces off. "I am allowed," Wesley called back. "You married me. It is in the agreement." She laughed, that low, warm sound he had come to think of as the truest music in his life, and closed the last of the distance between them, catching him around the waist and kissing him soundly on the cottage step in full view of the village green, where old Mabel Croft, passing by with a basket of mending, only shook her head fondly and did not so much as slow her step, because by now the whole of Millhaven had grown thoroughly, unremarkably used to the sight. That evening they sat together beside the mill's small hearth, the same steady flame that had, without either of them quite noticing the moment it happened, become the only fire either of them needed, no longer two separate blazes built cautiously near enough to share warmth, but one single fire built by two people who had chosen, again and again, in every season and every trial since, to keep it burning together. Shagrol rested her head against his shoulder, right over the mark that had once nearly cost them everything, and had instead become the truest proof of everything they had built. And Wesley wrapped his arm around her, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the solid, living warmth of her against him, and thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, that he had gone up into those hills a lonely man checking a failing spring, and had come back down having found, against every fear the world had tried to teach him, exactly where he belonged. "No regrets, Miller," she murmured, half asleep already against him. "None," he said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Not one, Shagrol Fireblood. Not for the rest of my life." Outside, the mill wheel turned on through the soft dark, steady and unbroken, carrying the village's bread and the season's promise both, and inside the fire they had built together burned low and warm and utterly, permanently theirs.